Welcome to this lecture on personal identity. The problem of personal identity can be considered, often is considered to be a special case of the problem of identity over time. So personal identity asks the question, people, individuals change over time. In what way are they continuous with the people they were before? And similarly, the more general question of identity over time is the question, objects change, so properties come and go. What makes them identical to the objects they were before? What makes an object at a given time identical to the object it was before, despite these changes? Okay, so what is continuous? What remains? How do objects persist? There are a couple of more general remarks I want to start with about the general problem of identity over time, and then we go to the more specific issue of personal identity. One more general remark I want to make is that this is a classic problem, even more so, arguably it's the first problem in the history of metaphysics, the problem of identity over time. Aristotle's Metaphysica Alpha, for instance, describes how the philosophers before him, the pre-Socratic philosophers, all tried to account for identity over time. So some of them argued, for instance, that what doesn't change is the substance. An undefined substance, or water, or air. There were various proposals. The atomists, for instance, argued that what doesn't change are the atoms themselves. What changes are the constellations these atoms constitute. So they collide, and this collision produces objects temporarily, and when these objects break down and the atoms are again free from one another, then the object ceases to exist. That's the atomic account, the atomist account of identity over time. Identity is temporary collision of atoms. Okay. Now, two of the most interesting and radical proposals famously are by Heraclitus and Parmenides. Heraclitus arguing that there is no identity over time. So if the question is, what is identity over time? How do you match that or bring that together with change? The answer of Heraclitus is, well, there is only change. Everything is continuously changing and nothing is ever the same at two instances of time. And famously, he argued, or he expressed that by saying that you can never step into the same river twice. And the second time, the water that is around your feet has already changed. So it's not the same river anymore. Moreover, you are not yourself anymore either, because you have also changed a little bit, of course, but still you have changed. And so you are not the very same person as you were the first time you stepped into the river. Okay. Parmenides, by contrast, says, no, this change we perceive in the world is only illusory. There is only identity. Nothing ever changes, really changes. All that is, and all what is, and what is not, is not. There can't be any movement, there can't be any change. And his pupil Zeno famously argued for this with the famous paradox of Achilles and the tortoise. One more thing before we start. In contemporary philosophy, one important notion is the notion of Cambridge changes. If you want to account for change, and so this goes hand in hand with accounting for identity over time, accounting for change. If you want to account for change, what you should look for is that you do not consider mere Cambridge changes to be proper changes. And Cambridge changes are changes in relation to the rest of the world. So of objects or subjects in relation to the rest of the world. For instance, Stefan, the filmmaker behind the camera. He is, at this very moment, the best philosopher in this room. But suppose, all of a sudden, Wiep van Bunge enters this room. Then, Stefan loses the property of being the best philosopher in this room, and Wiep gains the property, suddenly, of becoming the best philosopher in this room. So the property of being the best philosopher in this room, Stefan had it before Wiep entered, and loses it after Wiep entered. And so he changed. But this is only a change of, this is not an intrinsic change of Stefan. He's simply standing behind the camera, being the best philosopher in the room before. And then he loses that property, though nothing really changes in Stefan himself. And so these properties that come and go because of things around you or around the object, these are mere Cambridge changes. Here is a little bit deeper thought for you. If Heraclitus is right, that there is no identity over time, that there are only changes, then all changes are mere Cambridge changes. Then the notion of Cambridge changes generalizes. So, whereas we feel we should distinguish between real change and intrinsic change, and do away with or avoid Cambridge changes, if you think the intuition of Heraclitus is interesting and you want to go all the way with Heraclitus, that implies that all changes are such Cambridge changes. So now about personal identity over time. The notion of personal identity over time can fulfill different functions. And a rich conception of personal identity over time is that the account should also be able to say in what way persons have a life before they were born and have a life after they are dead. Yeah. Many religions think that the life of a person is only a moment in a whole process, and that there is a pre-existence before this life and an after-existence, an afterlife we call it, after this life on Earth or in this specific constellation. These cultures that have these notions typically propose soul as the seat of personal identity. So two people are identical with one another, are the same person but at different moments of time, if and only if they have the same soul. What is continuous, what doesn't change, what is immortal, also in this particular conception of personal identity, is soul. Obviously, this notion has also there are lots of problems with it, and it has the solution to the problem of personal identity has lots of disadvantages. apart for the deep wish for a pre-existence and an afterlife, there doesn't seem to be much arguments for the existence of a soul. On the other hand, the opposite view is, let's call the first view the soul theory. The second view we need to consider, it's more or less the opposite. It doesn't think of the person, of personal identity in terms of something mental, more specifically the soul, the essence of the mental, so to speak, but rather in terms of body. A human being is the same person he or she used to be earlier and will be the same person later, as long as the body continues to exist and basically in its basic functions. Yes, well, there are also interesting problems with this idea of it's this animist theory. Yeah? We are basically animals. Our identity is our bodily identity. There are problems with that because, the body can undergo all kinds of changes without destroying the personal identity. And this conception of personal identity doesn't fulfill the role we want it to fulfill either. For instance, think of the following problem, thought experiment, actually, by Benjamin. Suppose you had a disease that is actually fatal, but the doctor says, I can treat you, I can make you live. You will survive if you undergo this surgery or something. There is one little caveat, or there are two caveats though. You will only survive as a plant. Okay, so you won't be able to perceive, interact with the rest of the world, but you will be a plant. So your basic functions will still function, you will still breathe, etc., etc., and there will be some exchange, so you will be able to eat and etc., but you won't be able to perceive or interact in a more subtle way with the rest of the world. This is one disadvantage, and the second disadvantage is that you have to spend all your life savings to pay for this treatment. So it comes at a high cost as well. So you won't be able to give your money to your beloved ones or whatever, to your beloved project. Would you then opt for this surgery? Would you want to survive as a plant? And most people say no. If personal identity is only the continuity of your body, bodily continuity, then we should say yes. But so that this is not the personal identity we care for. And that's an indication that what we want from our conception of personal identity is richer than mere body. Another thought experiment, by the way, a famous thought experiment by John Locke, is a thought experiment in which he imagines the possibility of a switch of bodies. It's perfectly possible, he says, that a prince and a cobbler switch bodies. So the prince will start to inhabit, after this thought experiment, will start to inhabit the body of the cobbler and vice versa. Locke insists it's the prince in the cobbler's body, it's the cobbler in the prince's body. Okay, so the prince is continuous, independent of the body in which he inhabits, and the same applies to the cobbler, okay? And this possibility that you can imagine this and think about it, that you can analyze it in this way, the prince in the cobbler's body, the cobbler in the prince's body, that's sufficient to say that you can tell these notions apart, and so that personal identity can't be mere bodily continuity. Now, the nice thing about Locke's thought experiment, the tale of the prince and the cobbler, is that it's not only a counterexample to animalism, the idea that two people or two persons are identical to one another if and only if their bodies are continuous. It's not only a counterexample to a theory, it's also the starting point of Locke's own theory. And his own theory is not in terms of a soul, or not directly in terms of a soul, which the two persons that swap bodies have together, share. It's a more specific view about what mental aspects account for personal identity. It is the memory theory. Locke's theory is the memory theory. Two people are identical to one another if and only if they share an experienced memory or remembered experience. One. And that's interesting, that he only requires one overlap between the memory of the one and the memory of the other person. Actually the same person, but at different points of time. So one shared, one common remembered experience suffices. Now you can easily think of objections to this proposal. For instance, we all remember that 1 + 2 = 3, right? So we all share this memory, so we must be identical to one another. Yeah, okay, but that's not exactly what Locke means, of course. When he speaks about experienced memory or remembered experience, it is exactly the kind of experience that only you have access to. For instance, let me give a very simple example. Your first kiss. Normally speaking, in normal circumstances, there was somebody else involved in your first kiss, right? But you experienced your first kiss in a certain way, and the other person experienced it in another way. You have only access to how you experienced it, not to how the other person experienced it, and vice versa. So you are identical to the person who gave your first kiss because you remember from your perspective that experience. That's Locke's idea, okay? Nice solution, but of course there are problems. Two major problems. Firstly, another tale, another thought experiment, famous thought experiment by Thomas Reid, another empiricist, much later, Scottish empiricist, that was not very fond of Locke's theories in general, and not about this particular theory either. And he proposed the following thought experiment. Suppose the same person, so we stipulate in this thought experiment, we stipulate that it's the same person. Suppose somebody is a boy that steals apples in his youth. Then as a middle-aged person, this person is an important person in the army and has an important victory. And at the time he has this victory, he remembers being a boy and stealing apples. And how that felt, the experience of stealing. Okay. And then much later, he has become a general and has become senile, and he only remembers being an officer, for instance, in the army and making this victory, but not anymore what happened in his youth when he was stealing. That last thing he doesn't remember, but what he experienced as a middle-aged person, that he remembers. So now you should say that the officer and the boy are identical, are the same person. And you can say that the general and the officer are the same person on the basis of Locke's criterion of personal identity, but you can't say that the general is the same person as the boy. And that's, of course, not only counterintuitive, it violates transitivity of identity. If A is identical to B and B is identical to C, A must be identical to C as well. Okay, so this is a quite interesting counterexample. Reid also used this counterexample, the tale of the officer and the senile general. He also used this tale or thought experiment to argue for his own view. And this view he shared with Butler, also contemporary of Reid. Butler had another objection and then a similar solution to Reid's. The objection of Butler was, this account is circular. You, Locke, you say that the kind of memories that explain in what way two persons or the same person at different times are identical is because they share the same experienced memory. But then you explain that this kind of memory, the relevant kind of memory, is the memory to which you have only access from your perspective, from the perspective of the person, him or herself. And that's exactly what you have to define. So you assume personal identity to account for personal identity or to explain where, what personal identity over time actually is. And in that way, your account is circular. It's the thing you have to define and you use it in your definition. As we will see, contemporary in the lecture, contemporary accounts try to solve exactly this problem, this circularity problem. There are subtle solutions to it, but they have, of course, their own problems. Finally, let me indicate what Reid's and Butler's solution is. That may sound strange, but it very often happens in philosophy that if you find that you can't analyze something, for instance, in this case, you can't analyze personal identity in terms of memory because of the two objections, the one by Reid, the one by Butler, then you might think, well, it's impossible to analyze the notion altogether. And what we now do is to say that the notion is primitive, unanalyzable.